When police entered the farmhouse on November 16, 1957, one officer vomited immediately. Another radioed for backup and refused to go back inside. What they found would rewrite how America understood the word insanity. But this isn't the Ed Gein story you think you know, because almost everything popular culture tells you about this case is wrong. And the truth, the actual court records, the psychiatric testimony, the voices of the families reveal something far more important than horror. I'm going to show you the two confirmed victims, not the myths, not the rumors, and why this case changed American mental health law forever. Stay with me, because by the end, you'll understand why this matters to you today. November 16th, 1957. Plainfield, Wisconsin. Population 642. Frank Worden opens his mother's hardware store for the morning shift. The register is open. There's blood on the floor. And his mother, Bernice, 58 years old, widowed, respected, is gone. Within hours, a simple sales slip will lead police to a farmhouse 7 miles outside of town, to a man neighbors knew as Odd Eddie, the quiet handyman who helped fix roofs and clean barns. What they find there will become the template for every horror movie villain you've ever seen. But that's not what this story is actually about. And before we go further, let me show you something. This farmhouse right here became the most investigated crime scene in 1950s America. Remember this image because everything I'm about to tell you connects back to what happened inside those walls. The investigation began with the smallest clue, a sales receipt Frank found on the counter. It listed an item purchased just before the disappearance. Detectives followed the paper trail, then the witness statements, then the neighbor who had seen someone in the shop early that morning. The name that kept coming up was a local handyman, Ed Gein. Plainfield was a place where people minded their own business. Privacy wasn't just a habit, it was a value. Families solved their own problems. Mental health services didn't really exist. At the time, struggling meant you prayed, you worked, and you pushed through. But sometimes a community's silence becomes a kind of blindness. Police drove toward the Gein farmhouse, an aging structure sitting alone on acres of frozen earth. They expected to find a missing person lead. Instead, they found the threshold of a story that would shake the country. Before we go deeper, we need to anchor this story where it belongs, with the people who were lost. Bernice Worden wasn't just a name in a headline. She was a mother, a business owner, someone who opened her store early and stayed late to help anyone who walked in the door. Customers remembered her as steady, warm, and patient. Mary Hogan, the tavern owner who disappeared in 1954, was known across town. Funny, sharp, loyal to her regulars. Her family lived with years of uncertainty, wondering if she'd ever come home. These are the two confirmed victims. Everything else, rumors, exaggerated body counts, urban legends, remain unproven. For accuracy and for their dignity, that distinction matters. By the time detectives gathered enough probable cause, the sun was setting over Plainfield. Frost climbed the windows, and the farmhouse waited. Dark, silent, unassuming. Before I show you what happened next, I need to tell you something most videos on this case completely miss. It's the detail that changes everything. Stay with me for 30 more seconds. Ed Gein's world had narrowed long before that night. His father died in 1940. His brother died in 1944 under circumstances many still debate. His mother, his anchor and the dominant force in his life, died in 1945. From that moment on, Gein lived almost entirely alone. Grief doesn't excuse anything, but grief without community, without intervention, without treatment, it becomes something else. Psychiatrists would later diagnose Gein with severe psychosis, a disorder that distorts reality beyond recognition. His symptoms weren't subtle: delusions, obsessive behaviors, profound isolation. These findings were not speculation. They are part of the public forensic record. But again, most people with mental illness are not violent. This case is an extreme exception, shaped by circumstances Plainfield had no tools to address. Now, remember the farmhouse I showed you at the beginning? Here's what police actually found when they walked through that door. Officers stepped inside with flashlights raised. Dust hovered in the air. Newspapers from a decade earlier lined the walls. And then the discoveries. A workshop filled with objects removed from local cemeteries. Tools repurposed for rituals no one understood. Evidence of homicide. Evidence of grave disturbance. Evidence of a reality Gein lived inside that no neighbor, not even those who suspected he was odd, had imagined possible. One officer left to vomit behind the barn. Another refused to step inside again. The farmhouse had become a physical map of a mind in collapse. For years after the arrest, the legal system and medical professionals tried to answer one question: how do you hold someone accountable when their mind no longer connects to reality? Courts first ruled Gein incompetent to stand trial. He was committed to a state psychiatric hospital. Decades later, after treatment, he was declared competent and faced a bench trial, not a jury. The judge delivered a precise ruling: guilty of the act, not guilty by reason of insanity. This wasn't a loophole. It wasn't mercy. It was the legal recognition that his psychotic disorder made criminal intent, as the law defines it, impossible. He was committed to institutional care for life, where he remained until his death. This distinction matters because it illustrates a hard truth. Justice and mental illness intersect in ways that defy simple answers. Plainfield changed overnight. People who never locked their doors now secured them twice. Parents checked windows. Neighbors called each other at night just to say, "Are you up? Did you hear anything?" Communities heal in slow, uneven lines. Some stayed, some left. But the memory, the real memory, not the Hollywood version, stayed with them. When you speak to the descendants of those who lived through it, you hear something surprising. They don't remember the horror first. They remember the grocery, the tavern, the hardware store. They remember routines, laughter, weddings, picnics. This story is part of Plainfield's history, but it doesn't define the town. What defines it is how people carried on, together. Remember the question I asked at the beginning? How did this case change American law? Here's the answer. The Gein case forced lawmakers, judges, and psychiatrists to rethink competency to stand trial, legal standards for insanity, institutional responsibility, and the difference between mental illness and dangerousness. It became a reference point in debates about psychiatric hospitals, deinstitutionalization, and modern forensic psychology. You don't see that in movies, but you feel its impact every time courts ask whether someone understood the nature of their actions. We're almost at the end, but here's the part that matters most: what this means for us today. This story isn't just about a farmhouse or a criminal case. It's about prevention, about what happens when a community lacks mental health infrastructure, about what happens when isolation festers without intervention, about what it costs families when the system fails early. Because at the center of this story are not monsters. There are victims, there are medical realities, there are systemic gaps, and there are warning signs we still struggle to address in modern society. Plainfield kept going. People rebuilt routines. Neighbors checked on each other a little more. The small acts of care, borrowing sugar, sharing meals, fixing a fence, became tiny stitches that helped mend the fabric of daily life. And through it all, the memory of Bernice Worden and Mary Hogan remains. They deserve to be remembered first as mothers, workers, neighbors, people who mattered, not as symbols in a cautionary tale. Remember them that way. And remember what their loss asks of us: to do better with the systems we have, to recognize warning signs sooner, and to protect the vulnerable before tragedy begins. This case is the first in my series on crimes that changed American criminal psychology and mental health law. Next, I'm covering Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker. If you want that episode, hit subscribe.